All right, won't have any notes, but it's about time to introduce you to Proselint. So, the problem that we're facing is that writing is hard. I'm sure all of you know this, and writing well, that's harder. And writing science well, that's even harder. Now, there's a solution to this that people have put out there, which is that there are all these books that have lots of guidelines about how you should write. In fact, the US government has a law passed called the Plain Writing Act that requires all of the governmental publications to follow a set of writing guidelines that are established by this law, so that lay people can understand everything that is published. The degree to which that's followed, we'll leave that up in the air. But the point is that even if you have that solution of it's all in books, there's a problem. It's all in books. We have all this advice and it's stuck. Because books, they aren't the things that do the writing. People are the things that do the writing. They do the writing of the books. So what we need to do is de-hostagify the knowledge. Get it out of the books and into the writer's hands. But that's actually not the right solution either. Because even if you wanted to go and read all those books, you had to predict which of those books were going to be good for you. And you needed to then, when you're actually doing the writing, to remember the advice and then to recognize that it's appropriate and then to apply it appropriately. And that's each an error point, and so you're likely to fail more often than not. Well, that's not true, but you will be more likely to fail in comparison. And reference books exist, but in order to go and look at a reference book, you have to interrupt the writing that you're doing. And again, you can only use them if you notice that you need them. So all in all, reading a well-established guidebook for English prose styling, such as Strunk and White, makes you neither Strunk nor White. So better is to get advice out of the books and into the writer's heads, where it doesn't need to be interacted with so actively. But even that is kind of difficult because we only have so much time and so much memory in life. And you don't want to spend all of your time reading those books and then memorizing everything and then establishing the habits. Like manually, you will never have time to do anything else. And there are experts who actually know all the rules and are able to get intuitions about things that aren't even rules. They cost money, and there's no possible way that there are enough of them that could keep up with the rate at which people produce written work, especially urgent written work, emails, for example. So the solution is take the people out of the picture and create a linter for Prose. So Proselint is a open source, BSD licensed linter for English prose, specifically focusing on style and usage. Quickly, let's do a little test drive. So this is our website. You can get to it by proselint.com/write. And we have this initial paragraphs that introduce the idea, but then as you go down, first of all, note, this is fully editable. What? Oh, thank you. And as you highlight over these things, they should be popping up. There might be issues with the website right now. Well, I have a picture of it anyway. That's what this helm is for. So, for example, you go to the website and you have an editable interface, and as you are writing, things will be underlined, stuff will be put in the gutter that'll let you know that, oh, you've made an error as you're doing it. And if you hover over the underlined text, it should pop up a thing. In this case, it's telling you that you're being redundant in saying it's a US dollar and a $, which isn't true if you are in another country, like Canada or Australia, but to the extent that it's usually used in the context of US dollars, it is redundant, and that's most of the time in written work. Oops. So you have an idea a little bit of of what it's kind of doing. Now you can just install it. Pip install Proselint, that's all you need to do. It's Python 2 and Python 3 compatible, and once you have it, all that you need to do to use it on the command line is type Proselint and then whatever file name you want. So For example, I got the pep repo from GitHub, and the style guide for Python is pep8 for how to write with the appropriate style. So let's go and check that for what Proselint says about it. So we run this, and what we end up with, so what we end up with is just a bunch of spacing inconsistency things, saying that in some cases you have one or two spaces after a period. No cases where you have more than that, so that's good. And a bunch of cases where ellipses could be proper ellipses, like the Unicode character, but are just approximated with 3 periods in a row, which, who wants that? Popping back into the presentation. So as you might have noticed, the way that this is sort of laid out is the file name, the line number of the error that was found, the column number at which it begins, and then the name of the thing that was caught, and a message explaining what was caught. We tried to find a name for what this was called because a lot of linters seem to use this format, and we couldn't. So I'm calling it the SLUF, the standard lint format. Partially because SLUF means to dispose or get rid of, and that's exactly what you want to do with all the errors that your linter is picking up. Additionally, in addition to the SLUF output, you can get JSON output, which is going to be way less pretty to look at as a human being, but it has much more information. So, as I said, not really what you want to be doing, but you might notice in here that there are regular expressions that'll do some substitutions for you if you want to enable that, as well as a full layout of where exactly the errors are taking place with more specificity than was described before. So the way that that's laid out is a standard JSON document where you say, again, what is the check that is being called? What column is the error starting on? How many characters does the extent go for? And that's in terms of visible characters, not in terms of bytes, because that's what we're using right now. I actually cut out some of the things here and for the sake of display, and there's more information if you want it. The point is that even though there is the nice pretty way of having all your errors displayed to you, you can just go and get all the data, which is nice. And possibly even more importantly for many of you is, in addition to the web app and the command line script, you can integrate it with a bunch of the most commonly used text editors, including Sublime Text, Vim, Emacs, and Atom. You might notice that there are little GitHub images of people above them. Those are the contributors to this open source project who actually extended Proselint's capabilities to apply to those editing environments. So thank them if you see them. So what have we done, like, concretely in terms of changing the world so far in terms of Proselint? Well, we advised the White House on their federal source code policy. Made some contributions to the Open Logic project textbook on advanced logic, InfoActive's data and design book, and most of the papers that were actually submitted to SciPy this year, the proceedings. So now that we've discussed sort of what Proselint is and what it does, I want to take a step back and ask you a much more theoretical question of, like, what really is a linter? Most generally, it's just a nudgy way of getting yourself to commit to something for some arbitrary norm that you would like to follow. Nudgy in the sense that you don't actually have to follow it. It's just like trying to urge you, maybe poking you in the side by having the little dot in the gutter. But what that ends up being is just a way to crystallize some authority around what standards you're supposed to follow. So when it comes to language, usually we're talking about programming languages. And so it's a device for checking for errant, dangerous, or stylistically aberrant code. Proselint, instead, is checking for whether your prose meets expert style and usage guidelines for English prose. And there are other kinds of linters that you could imagine that generally fit this picture, but we'll have to talk about that offline. So there are 3 questions that you can pose to any linter based on the way that I just described it. Whence, when, and which. Whence, from where do these norms and rules originate? When do you actually apply the linter? Like, when do you use it to see what comes up and what errors are there? And then which rules, like how do you determine which rules are the good rules, the rules that you want to include? Even if the authority had said it, perhaps in your use of it, you want to use something slightly differently. So for PEP 8, again, the standard Python style guideline, Whence gives us Guido van Rossum, Barry Warsaw, and Nick Coughlin. These are people who were important for the development of Python, and they've just said that these things are important to do, and so we do them. But the when is somewhat interesting. You don't actually have to write following PEP 8. You just need to make your code eventually match PEP 8 when you start pushing it to other projects. Or if you were trying to publish some finalized code of your own project, if you wanted to follow PEP 8, you would do it then. But you don't really need to be following it as you're writing. Maybe that's more convenient, but you don't have to. And then the question of which rules to actually consider and include. The fundamental principles that are laid out in PEP 8 are that readability counts in terms of code, but also in terms of the actual rules. Foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, I believe is the actual phrase, but abbreviated here is be as consistent as possible if it works. And there are a bunch of subcategories of rules that you can follow, include, cancel, whatever you want to do. But what I thought was really interesting here is that the way I was introduced to PEP 8 was in terms of being a linter. That means someone has implemented these guidelines that are supposed to be for human beings. I wasn't sure if they were designed with the intention of being able to be turned into a linter, so I figured I'd just ask. And so I did, and the answer is that it didn't occur to Guido. All that matters is that humans can read it, and apparently explaining to humans is the same thing as programming something in a regular expression. The point being that it's fortunate in this case that PEP 8 happens to be implementable by straightforward linting rules. It didn't have to be. And when you're starting to look at something as complicated as English language, where the norms are much more difficult to lay down because they haven't just been set up from the very beginning, it can highlight how maybe implementing some of these things would be a little bit more difficult. So for Proselint, the answer to Whence is experts on style and usage. That is, we've published works from well-regarded experts, and that is where the advice is going to be taken from and implemented in code. We don't focus on grammar, and we don't only focus on spelling. We have some spelling things, but they're more on in the vein of stylistic spelling rather than the standard lay out a dictionary and tell you whether or not this is a word. And all we're really considering then is style and usage for English prose writing. Why we're doing that, I'm going to get to later. So if you want examples of the people that we're turning to be able to establish these rules, probably the most prominent one is Brian Garner. His previous book, Garner's American English Usage, Modern American Usage, apologies, was where most of the work came from, and the initial stuff that we did. Now it's within the past 2 months, I believe, the newer book was released, and so we haven't actually been able to dive into its 900 pages instead of the 600 or 700 that were there before. So there's probably a lot more that there is to do than we even thought when I was first writing this talk and paper. And the rest of the things here, George Orwell, David Foster Wallace, Lynn Truss, Strunk and White, as I mentioned, these are all standard resources for style and usage in English that I highly recommend that if you want to peruse them, don't expect to be able to encode everything that they say, but they're interesting reads. So to answer when, the idea is think back to we want to be putting this in people's minds, not just in their hands. We want to give people advice as it's needed, exactly when it's needed. So traditionally, books, they require reading it, parsing it. So first of all, being able to comprehend a style guideline presumably should be easy, but in case it isn't, you still have to parse it, and then you have to figure out how to apply it. So that requires you to read before you write, or interrupt your writing, and most importantly, thank you, you're only going to be using it whenever you use it. You're having to think about it and seek it out. It's not going to pop up in front of you and let you know, hey, by the way, there's some things that you might want to change here. In contrast to Proselint, which does do that. Essentially, you have a bunch of experts perched on your shoulder, looking at everything that you write and just saying, by the way, fix that. It's really, just use a proper ellipse. And use a copyright symbol, not a parenthesis C, close parenthesis. There's no reason for this. And one of the nice things about having a interactive sort of format like that is that you don't have to have any effort before you write. You don't have to have any effort while you're writing. It's just there. And it's basically implementing a form of operant conditioning from old school behaviorism, if any of you know that theory in psychology, where you're going to learn, if you keep changing what you do on the basis of this signal, what your habits are when it comes to writing. So now this is the way that we can get it really imbibed by people and have people just embody the style guides. And one of the interesting things to note is that if you are giving people real-time messages, you want them to be minimal because you want them to look at them, hopefully decide to accept them, and then move along. If you want to analyze it afterwards, of course, you can always do that. That's partly what the command line is for. And that is going to have a ton more details, especially if you use the JSON flag. So which rules to follow? Now, this is probably going to be the most complicated of all the things that I'm talking about. So the phrase that I use for this is wield a rapier, not a cudgel. Because rapiers are tiny pointed things that you're able to be very precise about how you attack things, as opposed to a cudgel, which is a giant mace, essentially, that is going to damage everything in its path. You don't want to be saying that things are wrong that are not wrong. That makes you an untrustworthy linter. You want to just be able to follow your linter, whatever it says, without having to really think about it. Even if it's not telling you fix it this way, that there is an error there, you just want to be able to trust that. And the tools that you use need to earn your trust. So in order to establish that, we try to keep our false positive rates, that is the number of things that we say are errors that aren't errors, as low as possible, at the cost of sacrificing things that we could cover, errors that we might be able to fairly easily point out to you, but that the number of times that we would be wrong in doing that just doesn't make it worth it. Because that's how we break your trust. That's how Microsoft Word breaks your trust. That's how every other language tool that you use, and I mention Microsoft Word because that has the best possible in the corpus that we've assembled of well-edited documents that have been published in magazines and whatnot. When you look at the things that are flagged in that, Microsoft Word does the best, and it still has two false positives to every single true positive. So, and in order to evaluate this for ourselves, we use the lint score. That is just the number of true positives times 1 minus the false positive rate raised to a temperature that we're calling K that tells you just how much are you going to value the, how much do you want to penalize for a high false positive rate. And then, so this is the first two parts of that, and then the final part is we've made it so that rather than having to cancel out individual rules because there are just far too many to reasonably be going in there and tweaking them on a per word basis, we have a modularly organized code base that you can just filter out as it occurs. Thank you. So the implementation, like structurally, is we have a bunch of directories. Those are our modules. Inside directories, we have Python files. Those are our rule sets. And then inside each rule set are a bunch of rules that are going to take usually a list of strings and return a Boolean as to whether or not it is an error. In order to make all of this efficient, you could imagine that that would get very costly. We have caching in place and whatnot for results as we're going along. So if you wanted to program a rule, though, we have some nice helper templates that basically, you don't have to worry about the way that the function works and the underpinnings, and we can try to make it efficient for you. You just have to know something like, okay, this check, is it a check about whether a word exists? Is it a check about whether there is a preferred form for this word? Or are you being consistent across word pairs? One of the things I didn't get to show you that I wanted to was inconsistency between American and British spelling. And it's fairly easy to detect, and you can let someone know when you're collaborating with people across the seas, or if you're like me and enjoy British spelling anyway. So some of the modules that we have are checking whether you've left some annotations in the text, avoiding cliches, making your spelling consistent, date formatting, venery terms, which are the terms for groups of animals, like a murder of crows and a pride of lions, and I'm forgetting a murmuring of starlings, I think. Wonderful things. And I'm not going to talk about those because I'm running out of time. So one of the things that we discovered in attempting to do this, again, we're in the theory portion, right, is that there are ranges of difficulty for rules. It can be as hard as needing human intelligence to be able to establish it, down to a one-to-one replacement rule. You don't even need a regular expression. One of the reasons we don't do grammar and we do style and usage is that grammar tends to be much higher up on the scale in comparison to style and usage. Grammar is global, slow, uncertain, and complicated to implement, whereas style and usage is local, fast, certain, and simple. So if you want to help us out, there are new rules that you can find and give us, either in terms of extracting them as an editor or implementing them in code. You can tell us what false alarms there exist, because believe it or not, this is really hard to establish and measure. So anything you want to give in those terms would be very helpful. And of course, donations are gladly accepted. So advantage Proselint, we are fast, precise, authoritative. You easily and ubiquitously can access it on the command line, text editor, or web app, and then open source with plenty of easy opportunities to contribute. I want to say thank you, and to everyone, SciPy, Jupiter, the Berkeley Center for Technology, Society, and Policy, all of our contributors, the reviewers for our paper. And if you have any questions, I don't know if I actually have time for questions, but
we have time for 1 or 2 questions while the next speaker is setting up.
pretty well.
Repeat.
Oh, how does this do with LaTeX files, or LaTeX? It is designed to work with lots of text formats. There are some issues with that. HTML seems to give us more trouble than LaTeX. But we're going to work, one of the things we want to do is get a format detector working so that you don't have to make sure that your ending is correct, but we just figure out as it's going, like what sorts of errors aren't really errors, and on the fly fix our false positives if we are giving you them. So for example, one of the things we haven't fixed are quotes. We generally tell people to use curly quotes, but right now, straight quotes are actually used in a lot of contexts, and we flag that as an error when it isn't.